All right, everyone, thank you very much for coming to this event. This is by the Oxford Society for International Development. It's also in partnership with the Oxford University Bangla SOC. The Bangladeshi Society is hosting Sir Paul Collier with us. And again, thank you, Sir Paul Collier, for coming. So you recently released your book, Left Behind. Could you tell us more about what Left Behind is about and what the term actually means?
Yeah, thanks. Just before I answer that, let me start with two propositions you'll find very hard to believe, right? First proposition is that once upon a time, I was you, right? And the second proposition, which you'll find even more horrifying, is that one day you'll be me, right? I arrived in Oxford completely bewildered, brought up in a very different world. I was from what is now the poorest city in England, Sheffield, and both my mum and dad left school when they were 12, so the whole world of education was completely new to me. But once I arrived, it was, I threw myself into the political societies, the international societies, and, about 50 years later, here I am. And 50 years on from where you are now, one day you'll be, pretty much like me. So what is Left Behind about? It's about the people, unlike me, or for that matter, unlike any of you, who are not fortunate in life. I wasn't born into fortune, and I guess many of you weren't, but the very fact that you're students at Oxford basically puts you in the group that you've arrived, You're now heading for the boss class. Left Behind is about the people who don't make it into the boss class. Right? And more particularly about communities and sometimes whole countries that don't make it into the modern world of prosperity and success. So its sort of moral and political starting point is the work of Michael Sandel. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Michael Sandel's work. He's a professor at Harvard in basically political philosophy. And has anybody followed his edX talks online? He's had 30 million people around the world following his course. And he's got a very good book called The Tyranny of Merit. And The Tyranny of Merit is about the fact that the people who are successful come to feel that they've deserved their success because they've earned it. Right? Both he and I feel that that's just a travesty of the truth. Those of us who become successful do so with a large dose of good fortune. And the notion that we deserve all that success is false, really. The same goes at this level of communities, where it's more important, and the level of countries. In some countries, you're in one, just about, which have done rather well, though ours is now teetering on the brink of catastrophe. But there are many countries that haven't done well. And so Left Behind is about both communities and whole entire societies that have yet to catch up. In Britain, pretty well anywhere, or at least in England, anywhere outside London and the southeast. The magic triangle made up of Oxford, Cambridge, and London. If you take that as a sort of golden triangle geographically, the further away you get from that in England, the poorer and less chance people have, right? And Britain is very strikingly socially unequal, with very little social mobility from if you're born into misfortune, you pretty well stay in misfortune. So there's very little social mobility in Britain. There's also very little mobility at the national level, and I'm going to talk entirely about the international level now. Very little movement between the ranking of countries. The poorer countries tend to stay poor, and the richer countries tend to stay rich. There's good reasons, powerful economic reasons, they're not powerful moral reasons, but there's powerful economic reasons why that's the case. And part of Left Behind explains that capital investment tends to move from failure to success. So if you start in a poor country, instead of capital flooding into the country, it flows out of the country. That's true of the entire African region. There's a question later on about Africa, where the whole of the African region has a big capital outflow to America and to China, and to successful places, basically. Capital investment moves in exactly a dysfunctional direction. We see it at the moment spectacularly with huge investment flows into the United States. Even out of Europe into the United States, let alone out of Africa. And so what's really of interest is the few countries which have managed to catch up, which have managed to break that trend. And I'm going to start with Bangladesh, because it's a rare case of a country that 50 years ago was considered a total basket case. When I started as a graduate student, my professor, who was a professor of international development, a guy called Ian Little, and he was very worried about the future of Bangladesh. It was dirt poor, and he launched a campaign to help Bangladesh. And since I became his graduate student, I just got to Nuffield, he said, right, your first job is to just drive around the country picking up things that we can help send to Bangladesh. So that was my introduction to graduate life in Oxford, was that you're there to serve your professor. He was a great guy, I must say. And he was quite right to prioritize Bangladesh. But the amazing thing is Bangladesh has actually worked. It's now, sorry, I have a nasty habit of roaming around. Bangladesh has succeeded in getting into, it's just on the threshold of being an upper middle income country. And it's done that despite having very poor leadership throughout. So whatever has driven Bangladesh, it wasn't good leadership. Right? One way of countries recovering catching up is to have very exceptionally good leadership. Right? That certainly wasn't the story in Bangladesh. Right? It's had two dynastic families, both rivals, and broadly they've alternated in power over that 50-year period, and both been pretty rapacious. They're dynasties which have basically used their power to help themselves. So how has Bangladesh succeeded despite these very poor leaders? It was a bottom-up process driven by locally based, locally financed NGOs, really. It has the biggest and most successful NGO in the entire world. It's called BRAC. The initials BRAC have kept changing their meaning, but it's always been called BRAC. Right? Its core is helping poor rural women to get into little enterprises. And so the driving force has been private sector development, but from a very small entrepreneurship. So the entrepreneurship of rural women. And that was matched by Ahmed Yunus, who founded the Grameen Bank, which also became very well known. And that was similarly based upon a notion of little groups of 4 or 5 women who would jointly guarantee a loan. And that had proved to be a very effective system of credit. And so that micro process really lifted the rural economy up. And in parallel, quite fortuitously, a firm from South Korea blundered in and decided it would try and set up exporting garments from Bangladesh because it was so poor that labor was very cheap. And when it moved in about 1980, driven by the fact that wages in South Korea had risen very fast, because South Korea was one of the other countries which it was the first country which broke through. Incidentally, does anybody know what economic sector really broke through in South Korea first? It was an export sector. Yeah?
Was it automotive?
Was it what?
Automotive?
Nobody will get it, right? It's so unlikely, but it was wigs. It was wigs. They became #1 world exporter of wigs, right? Made with natural hair, right? So people could sell their hair and turn it into a wig and export it. In other words, that's a caution against this idea of, what we need is good development planning. No civil servant in any ministry is ever going to sit down and say, yes, I know the sector we should get into next. It's wigs, right? And yet it was, entrepreneurship actually found that was a good niche, right? So that's a side story. But the garments industry that was set up by this firm in South Korea that blundered in to try, benefiting from the fact that Bangladeshis were so poor that they were willing to work for next to nothing. At the end of the first year, half the people in the factory quit. Not because wages were terribly low, though they were, but because they realized that this firm didn't know how to operate in Bangladesh. They didn't understand, they were bribing the wrong people, they were just not understanding the local culture. And so they would do it themselves. They'd set up the firm themselves. And so a lot of these guys quit It turned out it was very cheap to set up a garments firm because all you needed was sewing machines. You didn't even need electric ones. You could get pedal ones. And so you just needed to be able to borrow, a couple of $1,000 and you could get going with enough sewing machines. And people would just scoot around their family, and especially any diaspora who'd got a decent job somewhere abroad. And that built very rapidly a remarkably successful garments export industry. Last time I looked, it was something like $30 billion a year exports. Probably you could Google it in 2 seconds and tell me it's now 56 billion or something, right? So that was a tremendous, so that this combination of an industry which had, by a fluke, taken off, and the bottom-up process in the rural areas, those between them drove the economy upwards very fast. One was an urban process, garments, and the other was a rural process. So that was the Bangladeshi story. It wasn't through the politics. And then suddenly, as you all know, there was a political revolution in Bangladesh led by students. It was fantastic, right? I was you in 1968 when we thought the student movement would overthrow the world, and we rioted and all the rest of it, and it didn't happen. Yeah? But Bangladesh it did. So it's an amazing example of a student movement that really has changed the political system. Yunus is brought in as partly the figurehead, partly as indeed the head. He's the right person about 10 or 20 years too late. He's now a really old guy. He's even older than I am, right? I remember we shared the stage because we both got the same prize at one stage, shared. And so I got to know him a bit. He was a really very nice man. So he's in the right job, but a bit too late in life. How it will work out, I don't know. Right? It's easier to topple regimes than it is to build. Right? If you don't believe that, look at the French Revolution, right? Here's a ship regime that was toppled, thank goodness. And now we're in this uncertain state where will Yunus be able to build something so that those dangerous forces of capitalism that drive capital away from places that are disturbed into places like America that look safe. So Yunus needs to be given the time to restore the confidence of the market. And I don't know whether he will or not. I mean, there's quite a lot of pressure to hold an election. I think that would be quite detrimental at the moment, because the people who win elections, you win elections through an organized party. And at the moment, there's only one organized party in the country, which is, remember, politics was between two dynasties, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Tweedledum's just collapsed, thrown out in jail. Do we really want Tweedledee to run things? I fear that Tweedledee would just take us back to the old game. Whereas Yunus rises above that, but he needs to be given the time to reassure. So I hope that the combination of youth, energy, and the wisdom of Yunus, there's a very exciting group which is actually co-led by a student here who's was my graduate student, is now just finishing a doctorate here, and he's got a part of a youth movement called the Youth Policy Forum, which has been running for a while, which does things exactly like what you're doing. It brings in wise old people like me, and wiser old people, not quite so old, who've actually done things, right? The Youth Policy Forum is designed to hoover up international experience of successful development, so that people a bit older than the students can learn what works. And so hopefully the combination of the students plus the Youth Policy Forum plus Yunus will actually restore confidence so that the market doesn't rush out of Bangladesh. I mean, we'll know in the next year. It will be very, very sad if it's allowed to spiral down. What can the international community, a place like Britain, do? It can support. It can support without question. It just needs to go to Yunus and say, what can we do that's helpful? What we should resist doing is going to Yunus and say, we think this is what you should do, because we, these wise people in Britain, we know best, right? I think of that as sort of the terrible, especially Britain and France are very bad at that. We've got this sort of imperial instinct that we can run things. The rest of the world has a very diminished appetite for being run by Britain. And so it's also a very diminished appetite for being preached to by Britain. So I think all the moral advice that we love to give to, the Afghanis, the Bangladeshis, whatever else, I think of that as a moral version of imperialism. In the Victorian era, it was the missionaries, and now it's a different agenda from pushing religion down people's throats. It's a different agenda, but it's no better. Societies, I think, should be left to sort out their own moral choices. We should stay out of that business. So that's Bangladesh, really. Should we move on to another one?
Yeah, so thank you for informing us all about Bangladesh, its history and its current political economic climate. But what about India, one of Bangladesh's neighbours? They're also going through some tumultuous times in their politics. And what do you feel are the biggest challenges India is currently facing that's stopping it from becoming a fully developed country?
Yeah, India, well, like all societies, India is complicated. I took the decision when I was a graduate student that India was just too complicated for me, and so I don't know India very well at all, right? So with that caveat, I will tell you what I think, but it's probably rubbish, right? I do have the advantage of having, each year I give a series of lectures to very important Indians who come to Oxford for a month to be told wise things by people like me. Right? I do exactly the same thing with very important Chinese. So I do the same thing for 50 Chinese chief executives of big businesses, and expound Oxford's wisdom to them. And it's very interesting. This last year I did this more or less consecutively. I saw 50 chief executives from China one week, and the next week this bunch of very important people from India. And so I will share with you what little bits of impressions I got from this. It was naturally quite a comic thing, because the idea that these two pretty successful, fast-growing societies have much to learn from Oxford is a nice conceit, but it's clearly a pretty deluded view. For some reason, these guys pay a lot of money to come, and anyway. So the Chinese, I have to say, were very worried. And I think perhaps for good reason. And the reason they were worried was that China's been hugely successful for a long time, but it was successful thanks to the leadership that began with Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping is one of my great heroes. If there was a posthumous Nobel Prize for economic policy, I think I'd give it to Deng Xiaoping, right? President Xi, who recently replaced him, has a very different approach. Xi is a centralizer, top-down authority, whereas Deng Xiaoping came in to succeed Mao Zedong, who had been an amazing centralizer, total power personified in him. And Deng Xiaoping set up a system which was much more decentralized and devolved. It was perfectly designed for rapid learning. Rapid learning is what you need when you don't know what to do. If you're in an uncertain world, such as now, what you really, really need is rapid learning. Right? If you want to have a comic exposition of why the British Treasury is perfectly misdesigned for rapid learning, you should listen to me on a podcast called Political Joe. Is anybody familiar with Political Joe? Yeah? So I did it just before Christmas. I did a sort of an hour with Political Joe. And to my astonishment, it went viral. Very scary for people like me, because I don't do social media at all. But it's been watched by, I think, just under 250,000 people. So it's whatever else it is, it's very funny. So I recommend it. Right? You could be the 238,001 person to listen to it or something. So here's what Deng Xiaoping did. He understood that China in 1980 was very, very poor. And the world that China came into was very uncertain, and he didn't know what to do. And he said, we in the Politburo don't know how to develop the country. If only more leaders would take that step of admitting ignorance. Right? So the first requirement for a really good leader is modesty. Right? which is quite scarce amongst leaders. Right? So Deng Xiaoping said, okay, let's think what our objectives are. He took a 5-year view, and he says one objective is to really drive per capita income up because we're dirt poor. And the other was always an economic objective like that, and then a social objective like reduce infant mortality. Right? So those were the objectives. And then he held a national competition to get into the Chinese civil service. And in the past, so he's building on a tradition of these national exams. They've been going on for hundreds of years. You needed in the past to know Confucius inside out and backwards. But he decided what he needed was people who understood mathematics, science, and economics. Right? So you take it, do a test. You've got to be in the Communist Party, and you've got to be aged 25 to 35. This cuts it down from 1 billion people to about 20 million. It's quite a lot, right? And then he picks the top 40. Right? And here you are. Right? I'm Deng Xiaoping at the moment, right? And you're the 40 top people in this examination. So I'll tell you, you are the top 40 people out of 20 million. Feel good about yourselves, yeah? Pretty good, eh? We've got 40 provinces in China. For the next 5 years, you are going to be the governor of a province. And you will have total power. Your word in that province will be God, because you're my personal representative. You've got plenipotentiary powers. Anything you want done, you just have to give an order, and everybody else in the region is required to follow you. Right? So, good news, for the next 5 years, you're going to be God in a region, right? Sounds pretty good, eh? Right? And then he says, right, you've got to do these two things. You've got to double your region's GDP, and you've got to halve its infant mortality. Right? Oh, and we'll be watching you. And if you haven't tried anything in the first 6 months, you'll be thrown out. You'll never get back in to the top 40. Right? So you've got 6 months in order to start an initiative. Okay, so you're going to be sent to province back there, which you've never been to, right? You've got to double its GDP and halve its infant mortality. Sorry?
Do I have a budget to do that?
Do I?
Do you have a budget to do that?
A budget? You'll get a budget. You've got all the region's budget, right? Spend it how you like, on yourself if you like, But I will be watching what you do. In particular, you've got to have some initiative going in the first 6 months on doubling GDP. You've got some initiative on reducing infant mortality. Do you know a lot about infant mortality, by the way? No? Okay, so what you're going to do?
Build 2 hospitals and then improve roads.
You're confident that what it needs is hospitals, this place?
I probably need to research that.
Anybody help? You've got to halve infant mortality, and you're studying chemistry or physics or something, right? What are you going to do?
I mean, I'd say, just back to your last point, we first have to figure out what the reason for infant mortality in that case is, or the top few reasons. Start attacking them one by one.
Who would know?
Maybe public health experts or academics in that area.
Oh, in that area. Yeah, because there might be, maybe there's malaria in this area. Or whatever, you don't know. who's likely to know?
Was the people who work and also live in that area?
Yeah, okay. I mean, you're going to want to go and say, why are so many kids dying, you know? What would you do if you got power and you're going to ask, right? Is the right word. You've got to recognize you don't know. The Politburo said they don't know, but you don't know either. And so it's an invitation to devolve agency. You can make things happen, but you don't know what to make happen. So you've got to quickly find people in your region who say, well, if, you know, I've been itching to get the infant mortality rate down, and this is what I'd do, and you've got to try things, yeah? And that happens in 40 different provinces, all trying to halve infant mortality, right? All trying to double GDP. And there's Deng watching them, right? And, you know, after 6 months, you've not tried an initiative on anything really. You've been building yourself a big command center, you know, so sorry, you're out, right? But what we've got as a result of this is 40 experiments in parallel going on around the country. 40 different ways of trying to get infant mortality down, right? Some are working better than others, right? So Deng says, what you're doing on infant mortality seems to be working pretty well. Now, what you're doing just behind doesn't. All I suggest is that you go and have a look at what he's doing. Now, it may be that his region's so different that he'll not, you know, it won't work for you. That's your call. All I say is go and have a look. You then decide whether you can apply anything or not. Right? And then over the course of 5 years, he sort of works out, really, if you're in coastal China, this is the way to double GDP. If you're in rural China, it's a very different approach. Same with infant mortality, right? So after 5 years, what does he do? Same again. The same competition, those, you know, the people who've actually done things, he's not going to penalize failure. He's going to penalize people who haven't actually tried enough experiments, you know. And so the people who've done well get promoted, and then he advertises for, you know, same thing. Another 2 million, another 20 million take the exam, another 40 new governors, exactly the same pattern. And that system persists for 8 5-year periods. Not all of them under Deng, but the same system carries on. This devolved experiments in parallel. Deng also goes and looks, his first visit internationally is to Japan and South Korea. Japan and Singapore. And according to Mao's theory of Marxism, when he gets to Singapore, the fascist capitalists are grinding the face of the poor into the dirt, right? Is that what he sees in Singapore in 1980? I was in Singapore in 1980, so I can tell you no, right? In 1960, yes, it was a desperately poor and corrupt country. By 1980, thanks to another great posthumous Nobel Prize winner, Lee Kuan Yew, it had grown very fast. And so even by 1980, it was manifest that this place was working. And so Deng was astonished He realizes that all this sort of Marxist stuff of Mao was rubbish. And so he wonders, could we do a Lee Kuan Yew in China? And so he tries to set up a coastal city in China that could become a success like Singapore. Right? Shanghai? Right? So that's the spectacular rise of China's coastal cities. So that's the story of very fast learning, very successful under Deng. And then she closes that and says, no, we've got to get back to much greater centralization. It's an open question now whether that will work. But the Chinese chief executives I talked to in these fancy meetings were pretty worried. Right? What they wanted to know was, will India overtake China in the 21st century? So I asked the Indians that I was teaching, and they were asking the same question, basically. Who will, by the middle or late 21st century, will it be an India-dominated world or a China-dominated world? They'd both rather given up on the idea that it would still be an American-dominated world, which I think is probably right. So let me finally get to your question about India. I think Modi himself seems to be over-inclined. He's a little bit like Xi. It's rather a sort of top-down process. Whereas the strength of India could be to just replicate the enormous rapid learning that Deng Xiaoping introduced. Because India is naturally very different regions, cultures, communities, languages. And so that's the strength of India, if it uses it. What India's not been very good at is learning within a network group in India. So Deng had got this joint system of devolution, lots of experiments in parallel, but then this learning across. The success was used to help failure transform. And India's not been very good at that. And that's what either Modi or Congress should, I think, be kind of encouraging, is this sort of learning from variation. Right, so much for India. What we got next?
So for the sake of time, we'll just do two quick short questions on regional questions. So the first one is about sub-Saharan Africa. You mentioned China, and they're obviously facing the difficulty of an aging population. Sub-Saharan Africa, they're resource rich and they have a youthful population. How can they best utilize this youthful population?
Yeah, so that is the number one question in the whole of international development, because the demographics of Africa are that it's got a huge youth population. Something like a quarter of all the population in the world by 2050 will be African. And what young Africans most need is jobs, 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 jobs. Right? Because jobs, if you've got a job, it gives you agency. You can earn a living. You can then, think of everything that comes from earning a living. So the right model for Africa is not really a lot of aid. I think that's really more a game of the past. I think what's really needed is starting opportunities to export. And what Africa needs, if it wants jobs, it needs firms. And where are the firms? Well, the firms are in East Asia, they're in Europe, and they're in America. And firms can very easily move into Africa, and that would be enormously helpful, I think. Just like it was in Bangladesh, with one firm moving in, that provided huge amounts of spin-off benefits that local firms were started, copied, learned from the first firm, the Korean firm. And that process can happen in Africa. There's a lot of research on this which shows that the firms that move in don't crush the firms that are there already. Not that there are, there's a great shortage of African firms, but that they can become models from which local firms learn. So of course Africa needs its own firms, but a good way of helping to get its own firms is movement in of foreign firms. So I'll sketch what I think of as the ideal model and where we can really help. And the one encouraging announcement of the week was from British announcement, was Annalisa Dodds, who I actually had breakfast with a few weeks ago. And she's announced, I think today or yesterday, that what she was doing was redirecting Britain's aid programme from trying to basically put sticking plaster on people to an approach in which we helped firms, help local firms, so that there'd be finance, risk capital for small firms in Africa. And that process is I think very, very good. We've got a few agencies that do that. There's a British International Investment, which is the rebranded Commonwealth Development Corporation. The British International Investment is really very good. It's the best of the development finance institutions. I convene about 30 of them each year at Oxford, about 40 in the world. And British International Investment is about the best of them. So we've got one institution there that's really good. And then there's a smaller one that's specialized in agriculture called AgDevco, which finances African agriculture, tries to create little firms, African firms, that produce food crops and such like, or export crops. I think these are very good. What will drive firms in Africa is risk capital. And remember, the private market doesn't direct risk capital to places that are poor. The risk capital of the market is all going into America at the moment, right? Out of Africa into America. So you need public agencies. So the public agencies that we have, British International Investment, IDEVCO, Europe has much bigger ones, European Investment Bank, EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. These are quite big agencies, well capitalized, that can put in risk capital to very poor places and get that. Risk capital is what's needed for little firms to grow fast. And that's